Hello and welcome to the Get Lit Festival. I'm Kate Peterson, Director of Get Lit Programs, a nonprofit housed within Eastern Washington University. Get Lit is a week-long celebration of literature traditionally held in Spokane, Washington. This year, all of our events are virtual and virtually all of them are free. To learn more about Get Lit, to find this year's schedule of events, or to donate, please click on the link below to visit our website, getlitfestival.org. Now I'd like to introduce Claire Walla, Get Lit's Assistant Coordinator.
Thanks, Kate, and thank you all for joining us for this discussion about graphic novels featuring some of the most talented authors and illustrators working in the genre today. Through their dynamic images, readers enter fairy tales, summer camp, girls' basketball team, a World War II era Japanese internment camp, and an apocalyptic setting in which Super Bowl celebrations incite a civil war. In all these places, through the intersection of images and story, readers also find themselves within narratives that confront issues of race, gender, sexuality, aggression, and coming of age. We're thrilled to have all these authors here. Before we get to the conversation, we'd like to introduce each artist, beginning with Mike Corrado. Mike is the author and illustrator of many books for children, including the Little Elliot series, which was released in 2014 to critical acclaim. He's gone on to illustrate several children's books and contributed to illustrated collections like What's Your Favorite Color by Eric Carle and Friends, and Sunny Day, a celebration of the Sesame Street theme song. His latest books, both released in 2020, are The Power of One, written by Trudy Ludwig, and his first YA graphic novel, Flamer.
Our next author is Kiku Hughes, a cartoonist and illustrator based in the Seattle area. Her work has been featured in the Beyond Anthology Volumes 1 and 2, the graphic novel anthology Team Avatar Tales, as well as the 6th iteration of the curated comic collection Short Box. Her first graphic novel, Displacement, was published by First Second in 2020.
We're also joined by Trung Li Nuyen, a Vietnamese-American comic book artist and storyteller from Minnesota, who was born in a refugee camp somewhere in the Philippine province of Palawan. Trung has contributed work for Oni Press, Boom Studios, and Image Comics, largely in the romance genre. His first original graphic novel, The Magic Fish, was published in 2020 through Random House Graphic, an imprint of Penguin Random House.
Up next is Ben Passmore, a comic artist who lives in Philadelphia. Ben's comics are about crime, monsters, anarchism, sexual dysfunction, police brutality, art theory, and his feels. He's the author of Dayglow A-Hole, Goodbye, and Your Black Friend.
Last, but certainly not least, is Sloan Leong. Sloan is a mixed Indigenous cartoonist, artist, and writer. She's written and drawn 2 acclaimed graphic novels, Prism Stalker and A Map to the Sun, and has short fiction credits with Fireside Fiction and Dark Matter magazine. She is currently living on the unceded land of the Confederate tribes of the Grand Ronde near Portland, Oregon. Welcome, everyone. And Sloan, we're going to go ahead and tip the ball to you.
Yay, thank you for the nice introductions, Claire and Kate. Yeah, I'm super stoked to be talking to all these amazing cartoonists. To start us off, for people that are watching that might not have heard of your books before or haven't been able to read it, would y'all share a quick summary of the books that are newest for you? Maybe starting with Kiku.
Sure. Thank you so much for hosting, Sloan. So Displacement is a story of a fictionalized teenage version of myself being pulled back in time and memory to experience Japanese American incarceration alongside my grandmother, Ernestina Teranishi, who was taken at the age of 16, forced to live in the deserts of Utah because of the racist hysteria that came about during World War II. So it's a story about family and memory and the power of memory, basically.
Awesome. Trung?
So my story is called The Magic Fish, and it is about a mother and son who are Vietnamese American immigrants of different generations, and they are navigating a language barrier in trying to communicate things that are important to them. And so they have opted to go to the library and read fairy tales to each other to kind of give each other a sense of where they are in their lives. And so it's about immigration, and it's about coming out, and it's about queerness in the 90s. but it's also about the ways that story kind of contain parts of the storyteller more so than the contents of the story. So it's about yeah, so it's about all of those things and about how fairy tales can bridge a lot of cultural gaps.
Awesome. Ben?
It was good. My latest book is Sports as Hell. It came out with Koyama Press. It follows a couple young Black anarchists during a sports riot that turns into an armed civil war, in which the two sides are defined as much by their political differences as their like sports sports fandom. So it's a goofy premise to talk about the sort of tension between political fantasy and the realities of like political outcomes. And Philly kind of.
Nice. And Mike?
Hi, my book is called Flamer, and it is about a 14-year-old Filipino white mixed kid who is away at scout camp. The year is 1995, and it's the summer before his first year of high school, and he is juggling friendships, bullying, encountering racism, dealing with body issues, and all that is the backdrop to Aiden coming face to face with his sexual orientation. So it can get kind of heavy, but I think there's some good jokes in there too, and I hope ultimately that it's a book about hope.
Great. And yeah, my book, A Map to the Sun, is about 5 misfit girls in like 10th grade, and they're forced to join their school's basketball team or get expelled because they're real rascals. And it's about learning to play basketball, making friends, making rivals, a lot of early aughts drama. Yeah. So I think the first thing I want to get into is kind of the formation of your stories. I'm interested in like what like the seed of these stories was and what the process was for developing it. So do you do outlines? Do you sketch? Do you like center the story on a character first, or are you more interested in like the grander plot per se? Or like, do you write prose? So anything you want to share about the seed and the process of developing that seed would be great. And maybe Mike can go first.
Sure. So I guess my seed is basically my personal story. Kind of like Kiku, it's a fictionalized personal account. But the character's name is Aiden Navarro. And so basically my process was mining my memory for experiences and things that I wanted to share in the book. So I just had this like really huge brain dump of ideas that, you know, I just had lists and lists of things. And then sometimes it would just be like a word or a phrase that would come to mind. Sometimes I would just sit and write about an experience for a while. I have the fortune of having some old journals from that time. So reading some like painful, awkward journal entries from my teen years, and also my pen pal, Lara, who the book is dedicated to, she scanned every single letter that I ever wrote to her as a kid and sent them to me digitally. And so I had this record of stuff that went down, and it was interesting going back and reading through all those, and there was a lot said and there was a lot unsaid, and it was really interesting the emotions that were coming up from reading these letters, even when I wasn't saying what I remember I was thinking. So anyway, and then I structured the book to kind kind of follow a camp schedule. I needed a structure to work with because I'd never worked in such a long form before. So every chapter is a day of the week, and then the chapter is kind of broken down by merit badge class schedule and, you know, just the things of the day, like meals and campfires, that sort of thing. Yeah, so that's what I used as a skeleton, and then I would just kind of plug in the ideas where they made sense. And so that's how things started to kind of come together for me.
That's amazing. Also, like that resource of having these old letters.
Yeah, I'm just like, oh my God, these are amazing. And also now I want to burn them all.
Yeah.
Like...
As someone who has burned old diaries and journals, I'd be like, oh God, what have I written?
Oh.
And it's still existing out there. Oh my gosh. Ben, do you want to go next?
Oh yeah, sure. I guess, so the sports is how, like, the idea, I guess I've been playing around with, like, doing some kind of polemic around anarchism, but more specifically, like, what is, like, a tradition that's called insurrectionary anarchism, which I think is, like, a little misunderstood now because of, like, the popular discussion of what it is. But the joke in my sort of anarchist circles is that the insurrectionary anarchists are sort of the jocks of the milieu, you know, like, but anyway, but I guess initially, you know, the Eagles won the Super Bowl here in Philadelphia. That was a big deal. You know, like, I've had, you know, since I was young, different types of people trying to get me to do sports. Specifically when I was like a little fat kid with no dad, people like, we know what this man needs, more hypermasculinity. So, like, I played football, I was terrible at it. I played basketball, I was terrible at it. So anyway, so I have like a weird sort of like, I know what sports are, I know the positions, you know, but I don't really follow it like that. You know what I mean? So, like, in some ways I could understand the energy that was out in the streets. And in some ways I just, like, I didn't know. I didn't follow that season. So, like, anyway, so people are celebrating in the streets of Philadelphia, people are doing chants. Like, I still was pretty new to Philadelphia. So, like, I didn't even know all the players and references and stuff. And as things turned into, you know, what's called a riot, but, like, a riot can be so many different things. But when things got, like, a little sportier, you know, when people were throwing champagne bottles at police, I started to think about how, and this was my first sports riot, but I've attended many riots, political riots, and something I was struck with was how similar they are, and also what it must be like for someone who's maybe never been in a city in which there's, like, political violence happening, how confused they would be. Because to me, if I'm if I'm in, like, a downtown and Black Bloc is popping, like, I have a pretty good sense of who's who and what's happening. I know the teams, you know what I mean? Like, I know the riot cops are gonna do. So anyway, so that was sort of like the initial, like, I guess that was like the initial thing that happened. I was like, oh, maybe I should write a story to talk about anarchism, but also this, like, sort of subset where, or this sort of, like, conversation that happens within radical circles in general, where there's, like, a fetishization of violence, of the riot and stuff, and people not really, I feel like often not understanding, like, the emotional realities of that. So yeah, which that's, like, grabbing from lots of random areas, but whatever. It's a weird book, and I think it's plays out because so I guess, like, so, like, the story, you know, it follows a protagonist who's, like, you know, a Black anarchist, but it also, like, she's sort of stuck with, you know, a sort of like a Black liberal activist and, like, a couple, like, white people, like this white couple that starts off real liberal, but they, by the end, whatever, no spoilers, that's not how they end up. Arguably, that's not where they ever were. So I guess like I don't know. Like usually, when writing something, I wanna like I'll walk around my neighborhood and I'll listen to like some music that feels like it embodies sort of like the vibe of the thing that I'm into. And you know, luckily Meek Mill had like a whole album that was basically inspired by the Eagles Super Bowl. So I'm like walking around my neighborhood and I think of like sort of like the trailer of the book. Like what's the big like, you know, what's the big standout moments? And then I try to like, you know, and in this case, this is like a comic about, you know, like Civil War, you know, so there's a lot of like, you know, explosions and like people in football jerseys anyway. So then when it came down to writing, like after I had these moments that I wanted to hit, I felt like I needed to justify these moments, you know, so that the driver not necessarily be people waiting for like a further spectacle of like more ridiculousness, but really sort of get at sort of like the emotional outcomes and the tensions between these people. So yeah, I think like I also like a big thing too when thinking about this, like when Anna Koyama asked me to like do a book, I had been doing a lot of nib stuff. So I was doing a lot of nonfiction stuff and a lot of editorial. And I came into comic like my early like Dayglow A-Hole was like the first thing I was going to shows with. And those were hyper political books through like this, at this point, pretty dusty metaphor of like a post-apocalyptic event. You know what I mean? So in a lot of ways, like coming back to Sports as Hell was like a return to form where I just like was desiring metaphor over like doing like very literal like nonfiction comics. Cause I felt like people just like, whatever, they like would come to my comics because they were expecting to agree. And I don't feel like I was catching anyone off guard.
That's really interesting. Yeah, your process seems very kind of instinctual, how you're developing these ideas, which is really neat. I definitely want to talk to you later about like the satirical take, like the satirical aspect of Sports as Hell later, and also sports. But yeah, very cool. Trung, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah. So The Magic Fish is my very first long form thing, and I'd never written anything very long before. And so I kind of went a slightly easier route where in my mind, I was like, okay, so this is my very first graphic novel, and I don't know when I'm going to get an opportunity to tell a long form comic book story again. So I'm going to tell all of the stories that I've always wanted to tell. So I just picked all of my, like the fairy tales that were most pertinent in my life because I wanted to draw those universes and draw those worlds. But they wanted a story that was a little bit more grounded. And so I wove all of my stories together, like all of my favorite fairy stories together in ways that were thematically resonant with me. And what ended up happening was that I chose 3 fairy stories, so 2 different versions of Cinderella for cultural comparison, and then wrapped it up with The Little Mermaid so that I can give people a sense of what these stories have in common, what they have to say depending on who tells the stories, and how those things kind of tie together within the broader narrative of queerness and of coming out. And so the ways that very old stories have kind of contemporaneous implications in the ways that we tell them and how they have sort of been co-opted by kind of larger corporate projects, and kind of getting them back into the hands of people who tell those stories colloquially to tell each other about themselves was kind of an important part of that structural process for me and getting the story to make sense. I picked the 2 Cinderella stories because Cinderella is one of the oldest stories. And so there is a Vietnamese version that I wanted to tell, and I wanted to compare it with a German and an English version that is really violent. So I like kind of dressed it down a little bit for my audience. And what wound up happening was that I had a lot of trouble figuring out the last story that I wanted to tell in it because I didn't want to reiterate Cinderella a 3rd time, but I wanted to make sure that all of those stories were kind of wrapped up a little bit neatly. And so kind of choosing The Little Mermaid in order to get the sense that that stories are about transition oftentimes, and they're about sacrificing one thing to go to another, and they're about kind of giving up agency and figuring out how to get that back, and how those stories can change over time. That ended up being a really perfect one. And so structurally, I just chose three short stories, and then I, wrote one longer story to wrap those things up, and then I got to kind of transition between those things and really examine what the imagination of each of the individual storytellers looked like.
That's great. So structured, so organized. Totally my polar opposite. Kiku, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so I started thinking about displacement during the election of 2016. And I knew I wanted to tell a story about, my family's experience in Japanese American incarceration camps. But the hurdle that I faced immediately was the fact that my grandmother, who was in camp, died before I was born, and hadn't shared a lot of her personal experiences before she died. So immediately I was struck by that hurdle and the idea that the facts of her life, there are certain things that I'll never know, and how do I tell a story without having those essential facts? So that is sort of why I turned to a time travel, memory travel element, to sort of de-emphasize the importance of like literal fact and really bring the reader into this idea that this is a fictional story, but it's based in an emotional truth, and to sort of make the emotional truth more important than the facts of what happened. So that was sort of one way that I initially knew that I had to sort of craft the story, I guess. And from there, my process was very research-based, of course, because I was doing a lot, given that I didn't have a firsthand account to go to. But I started out really wanting to emphasize what little I did know, because those, again, I felt like would be the core of this sort of emotional journey. So I really structured the narrative of the book by writing down all of the things that I knew based on stories that my mom had told me, that her mom had told her. And those, I felt like those events would have been the ones that made the most emotional impact in her life in camp, because those are the ones that survived generations of storytelling, of actually breaking the silence of talking about camp and actually wanting to pass down the story to, your child or your grandchild. So I really structured the key events in the narrative after those memories that I knew were important enough to pass down. And so from there, I just sort of filled in the rest of the story. But yeah, big events like the shooting, the murder of James Wakasa in camp, like the loyalty questionnaire. These were things that I'd grown up hearing about, so I knew that they were going to be the structural tent poles of the story.
Very interesting. Yeah, I haven't touched like anything where I would need to do a lot of research yet. It's kind of on my wish list. I want to do like a Hawaiian history one, but I'm very daunted by the prospect of having to research stuff. So I definitely admire you for that. I guess for my process is a bit more reflexive. I did like a very traditional sports comic, and like inspired by like Real and Slam Dunk, which is mangas by Takahiko Inui, and also just sports movies in general. I feel like they have very rigid story structures, so I didn't really have to worry about that. So I didn't really do any like preamble development. I just started drawing page by page. I kind of had ideas for the characters, but I just drew as I drew and wrote basically at the same time. And that was like a way to keep it like fun, and like I didn't know where the story was going. I mean, I did in the overarching plot, but like character wise, I was like, okay, what are these characters' dynamics? So yeah, it's kind of meandering, which a lot of readers are like not into, and some are. It's kind of in the vein of like josei and shoujo manga, which is more like emotionally interior. But yeah, also inspired by like I played basketball when I was in middle school. Was bad at it. I was also on a co-ed team, which was really funny. And there was also like all ages of middle school. So we had like these tiny little boys on the team. And then me, I was like this like giant girl. Anyway, yeah. Let's see, what do I want to ask next? I guess I'm interested in like, so you have your story, you have your idea, you've done your research. As you're drawing, was there any big like developmental changes that you went through where you're like, okay, I have to change this, this isn't working, or maybe the story, as you're drawing it, you're like, oh, this could be a better direction. Was there any like monumental changes that you experienced as you were making your comic? Mike, do you want to start?
Sure. I guess because this is my first graphic novel, there was a learning curve. For as many comics as I've read throughout my whole life, nothing really prepares you for it until you're in it. And I like quickly realized like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. So there were definite moments when I felt like I was feeling around in the dark, even though I've read books about making comics, but whatever. I think the challenge for me was, I'm slightly embarrassed to say that I just like couldn't wrap my head around how much space to leave for speech bubbles. And I, was a graphic designer for 10 years, like, okay. So I, thumbnailed everything out. My assistant and I kind of like laid out these, like a template in InDesign of all the panels. We printed those out. I like made a tighter sketch on there. We scanned those in, and then we tried laying out all the type, just placeholder type. I knew I was going to do digital type for the text, but we quickly discovered that there was not enough room. And so I had to kind of systematically go through and lengthen it visually to make room for the words. Because, there's editing, and then there's like, I can't cut any more words. Like, I need to say what I need to say. So I ended up adding 30 pages to the entire book, which I was like kind of gagged, but now I can't really imagine it being shorter than it is. So it all worked out in the long run. But other than that, that was like the big change. But I would just like to add that I think the biggest challenge was kind of like being productive while you're working on a book that's also very triggering and emotional for you personally. So there were days that I did a lot of juggling, like where I'd be like, I can't work on this chapter today. I'm not strong enough today. So I'd go for like the low hanging fruit or like do administrative work. So I just found that I had to be really flexible with my work schedule while also getting it done. That was the other biggie, I guess. So thanks.
Yeah, the word bubble struggle. I always underestimate how much room I need. I don't think I'll ever stop. Ben, do you want to go next?
Oh yeah, sure. I was also going to relate to like, there's always so much less room for talking than I think. Well, for sports, I was definitely like given up enough time to like write and draw it, but like, an essential part of my process for making comics is procrastinating like super hard for a while. So it ended up that I finished the full script or whatever, because, the publisher wanted to see that kind of stuff first. And then I just left myself like something like 3 months, I think, to do like 60 pages of comic, which I'm like pretty fast, I think, but like that's still, at least for me, just like not that much time. And also it's like a book with just like, especially originally written, just like a lot of crowd scenes. There's like a scene with like a crowd and police on horses. You know what I mean? Like any cartoonist knows, like it's a lot of stuff, you know? So it became like necessary to like almost immediately to get like pretty creative about not drawing things, but not making it look like I'm trying to avoid not drawing things. So like I changed some things like now the anchors are sort of like they're like, you know, they're these like weird like creatures with like the different football logos for heads, and they sort of like come in and out of the narrative through these sort of like repeat, like, you know, like a panel will be like repeat itself, like sort of stacked, like it's sort of like telescoping. And originally wasn't like that. Like originally, like the anchors played less of a role in the book. They were basically just like there in the beginning to talk about, like to give like whatever, some information about like Colin, specifically the sort of Colin Kaepernick stand-in, and then they weren't in the book anymore. So like I realized like I just needed to play with them a lot more, and also sort of like play a little bit with trying to replicate. And I don't know if this is successful or not, but sort of like replicate like the sort of sense of time I get when my adrenaline has been pumping just for like an entire night. So they sort of like come in and out, and they do round out the world a bit. So that was a big thing. And yeah, I mean, there was also just like the real issue that I didn't give myself a lot of time. So I didn't really sleep for like, you know, the couple months that I did it. I was renting a studio space at the time. So I would like sleep for a couple hours, like basically next to my desk, and then I'd pop back up. And actually, Sports as Hell was like the first book that I did that was like all digital. Before Sports as Hell, I would draw like, you know, with the brush and ink on Bristol board, and, you know, scan it, clean it, blah, blah, blah. And then do the digital coloring. But I knew that I didn't have time. So I like got an iPad. So I learned how to draw on the iPad by doing this graphic novel. And I'm sticking with it. It's cool. It's very efficient. But yo, those were the bigger things. And when you have so little time, I don't know about anyone else, but like particularly like towards the middle end, like I don't know if the book is good anymore. You know what I mean? Like I haven't slept. My relationship to the book at this point is just trying to like create the story that I want to create with just so little time. And you're making cuts, you're making choices. Like I'm definitely not like someone who over plans before diving into a graphic novel. I find that they're just not very good when I like over plan like that. But like the big problem is like, you know, I turned it in and I was like, hopefully the publisher will be straight up with me and tell me it's terrible. But that was like, there's definitely like a deep terror by the end that I was like, this might just be, you know, there's like what feels like typical Ben Passmore craziness, and then maybe it's a bridge too far and I've made something unreadable.
I think it's funny that you say like you're kind of worried about like not taking shortcuts, even though as cartoonists we kind of have to. I personally think it's consistently like hyper detailed throughout the whole book. So it's funny that you're worried about that, because I was like there's piles of trash and crowds, and like every tiny like can and like helmet is like perfectly detailed. So yeah, mad respect for that attention to detail, because that's not me. Trung, do you want to go next?
Oh man, I think one of the most heartening things about like doing a lot of these panels with other graphic novelists is that all of the problems that I experience keep getting echoed over and over. So I also had a lot of trouble with the word balloons and like figuring out making sure that the dialogue becomes like an integral part of the visual composition of the page. And I also had to learn how to draw digitally for this, because I did the first 2/3 of the book traditionally, and then I was like, oh, like apparently if you draw a comic book that's 230 plus pages long, the process of like penciling a page and then inking it, waiting for the ink to dry, cleaning it up, scanning it in, formatting it, and then sending it, like that adds up. I don't think of it as a lot of time, but that adds up to so many hours that I could just be doing, that I could just be drawing. And so, for figuring out how to draw digitally meant that like when I was finished drawing the image, I was done and I could just send it. And that, that really helped speed up the process quite a lot. My visual interest with this graphic novel kind of changed a lot over the course of my making it as well, just because at the beginning I was like, I'm going to tell a fun series of fairy tales. It's going to be like The Princess Bride. It's just going to be like a story within a story, and I get to like weave in between these, like the fantasy world and the real world, and I get to look at like what people were in the 90s and what like, and then just make up everything else. But then I realized that if I am going to be if I want the reader to empathize with the characters, I want to be really deliberate about the ways that I convey what their imaginations look like. So then I had to do research into, okay, so if this boy is 13, what does his imagination look like? What is the media that he consumes that makes him think that the images that he's conveying are what they are? And and then the middle story is told from the perspective of a Vietnamese woman who's like in her 50s or 60s. And so she would have seen an entirely different world from him. And so I had to research like what were the clothing that people wore day to day, like in her universe? What does a princess look like in her universe? And how does that, like what kind of mythologies inform that? What kind of media informs that? And I had to do the same thing with the mother character as well. And so it was sort of like an intergenerational look at all of the ways that things became iconographically specific. And so I wound up having to do a lot of research about like what mid-century Vietnam looked like before the Vietnam War, which was oddly really challenging because a part of the like an integral part of telling the story was recognizing that language barriers is something that the characters have to circumvent. And then I realized that all of the resources that I needed to have visually specific references to the spaces that I was trying to access were also language locked as well. And I don't have a strong grasp of the Vietnamese language, and I could like navigate a little bit, but I just didn't have like the full scope of that. And so I started to let that kind of like emotional weight carry itself into the stories as well. And so it was fun. Like I learned a lot of really wonderful things about the ways that, like I learned a lot about the Vietnamese national dress and how it's sort of this syncretic product of years of colonialism, like by China and by the French, and then the kind of contentious political history that was embodied by that garment for such a long time, and then the reclamation of it after the Vietnam War. That was so like, that was stuff that I would not know about literally at all, because my parents lived through it in such a particular way that was rooted in trauma, that all of the cultural aspects of it were not things that I was able to access as a child without re-traumatizing them. And then kind of learning about why, like in the American popular imagination, why do princess dresses look like this? It all kind of has a lot to do with wars and like what happens in the mid-century and the ways that like people were allowed to use fabric after, the war was over. And so it just, a lot of the things that I kind of took for granted visually, I wound up being very invested in and researching, kind of just researching to death. Everything that I wanted to say visually wound up, some were completely different than what I had originally thought it was going to be. So it was a really fun process, but it wound up being so research oriented.
I love that you took the time to do that research, because so many things like that, I feel like go unquestioned, like just, people's fashion sense, how they remember fashion in like their homeland, and how that is basically calcified in their mind once they leave, even if that place is changing while they're gone. You kind of have this just like permanent imprint of the last time you've been to like your motherland. So I really think that's cool that you took the time to do that. Kiku, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sort of similar to both Trung and Ben's answers. Definitely one of the big hurdles that I had early on is that, in all the stories people tell of camp, the crowds and the lines were a big part of that experience, having to wait in line for everything from toilets to meal times to all that stuff. And I learned pretty quickly that drawing a bunch of lines of people is the last thing I want to be doing with my time. So I ended up having to learn how to like create brushes in Clip Studio. And so I ended up making like a crowd brush, which is just like various silhouettes of people. That saved me quite a bit of time. And so that was part of it. Also learning how to use SketchUp so I could model a camp and just use that to create my backgrounds. I was pretty fortunate because it was all, these prefab military barracks, so they all look the same. So it was pretty easy to make. But those sorts of technical details were early on, I was trying so hard without them and just having a headache every day. So it was nice to be able to learn that. And in terms of the research, you never really think about these little mundane objects that are so drastically different now than they were in the 40s until I'm faced with like, what did the light fixtures look like? Were there even light fixtures? What did the clothing look like? They all got clothing from Sears catalogs. So looking through Sears catalogs into what the options were. Things like that, like what even the stoves look like, etc. So I was lucky enough to be able to visit the Topaz Museum, which was recently built in Delta, Utah. And they have a replication of one of the barracks. So I was able to go through there and see, what the light bulb situation looked like, which at the time, felt so important. And later I was like, why was I so concerned about that? It's like the least important detail of this book, but you get fixated on these really like small things that you have to try to recreate. So yeah, I guess sort of a mixture.
Very cool. I love that you were able to go to that museum and there was like, these material things that you could get inspired by and kind of see. That's really interesting to me. For me, my biggest challenges were I pitched this as like 250-ish pages and it's almost 400. And then oh yeah, well I guess like I was inspired by, like long sports manga where like a basketball game is like 5 volumes long and like the decision for like one of the players to like pass a ball is spread over like 30 pages and they're just like, I could pass it to Inui-chan, but but what about what my dad said 10 years ago? And then there's a flashback to like so yeah, I was like, oh yeah, I would love to do that. Can't do it in 400 pages. So a lot of my basketball games are like condensed into montages with like little highlights of like, okay, this character is going to learn how to like trust their teammates in this game. And you get like a tiny, so just like recondensing a lot of stuff that I wanted to like basically make its own book was a big challenge. And also I pitched this as like, or like my publisher wanted me to color it like with my like psychedelic colors, like non-literal coloring. And I was like, yeah, sure, that's fine, that should be easy. But after like 40 pages, I've used up so many palettes and I'm like, crap, I'm like running out of palettes to use. So that was another challenge of like kind of going out of my color comfort zone. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna use like beige and burgundy and like lime green and maybe that'll work, so that was a fun experiment in seeing what colors work and what colors don't. Let's see, I think I want to ask Ben about your comic next. I'm really interested, you're the only one in our group who is working in a satirical form, and I was interested in how you approached the book, because all of ours are more like kind of like pseudo autofiction and kind of based on like our lives or like our family's lives. And I feel like your characters, like you do have a protagonist, but when you have such like a strong authorial voice present, like you have a very critical voice in tandem with your characters like arc. So how do you like handle that? And like, are you expecting your reader to like be emotionally engaged with your character or emotionally engaged with like the story and you as like an author?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the issues about being someone who like likes to make jokes but also likes to talk about things that are like not funny, like right, the challenge is always like what is the agenda of the humor? Is it an expression of my lack of detachment, or is it like an extension of like where my humor developed definitely was like in an environment in which everybody is miserable, and like the joke is like, it's like a sort of like a moment of freedom from like, you know, what might be like a kind of existential death. And in a broader sense, like I do think that part of like the toolbox of like Black people in the United States, is our ability to like both feel things really deeply and also be like, nah, you ain't touching me, and be very funny and free in that way. I think with Sports as Hell, so there's that. There's also like my relation, like in my experience, like whether it be like a citywide sort of like crazy riot, you know, or it was just like a little like I almost said scrimmage, but like a little fight, a little scrum between, that's also a sports word, a little conflict between like, you know, Antifa and some fascists or something, you know, to be honest, like a part of it is funny, you know what I mean? Like it's the whole range of like of human experiences happening, you know what I mean? And sometimes it's funny because some people are taking themselves very seriously, like alt-right people that show up with like crusader gear, you know what I mean, like kitted out, and then who they're fighting is like, and this like I feel like was especially true like a few years ago, where like it felt like the alt-right was really like sort of you know, it was a new generation getting used to like street combat, and they were fighting people who like were very, very used to having to deal with like cops with like tear gas, like, you know, like batons, shields, blah, blah, blah. And like, you know, most like anti-fascists are just, they're at the demo in Black clothing, basically end of list, you know, like maybe some soccer pads on the forearm, something, but really nothing. So when it came to the alt-right, you know what I mean? They were very unprepared to deal with like what they thought were like snowflakes. They're like, oh, we're gonna beat them. Anyway, I'm going off on a whole long tangent. But what I'm saying is that tension was like, it was kind of funny to see because of the shock of the alt-right. Anyway, so I guess for me, like where humor feels appropriate is for me when I'm like writing something, it has more to do with helping to process like a very serious emotion. And it's not because I want to talk about something serious in this sort of like edgelord way where it doesn't touch me. Like the conclusion of the book, this character who basically everyone is making fun of, who like I feel like is you know, it's this person who's like basically like the Black liberal of like in the group. It's very much, he's very serious, you know, he's very committed to like finding like, you know, basically Colin Kaepernick to lead sort of like this movement of like Black civil rights or whatever. And by the end of the book, you realize like it's never gonna happen. You know what I mean? Like, and he's really the only one driving the book, like not even really the protagonist. And that failure, which is not a failure that, or it's not his dream, which is not a dream that I'm invested in, and I don't think the book is invested in. The fact that that is crushed, I think, like I didn't play that for laughs. You know what I mean? Like I think that is tragic. And me, like, you know, Sports as Hell is maybe like to its detriment, like overly metaphorical, but like definitely that metaphor, this like commitment to an impassioned sort of like sort of rejuvenation of sort of like the American dream, like, oh, we can appeal, like all we need is like the right person to like appeal for us to the world and the things that get better. Like part of the reason I'm an anarchist is I just don't believe that's possible. But I feel like we all go through a process, or I went through that process myself of being like, oh man, no, it's not gonna happen. So yeah, I think that's both of it. It's like I'm in trying to talk about conflict, like you have to include humor, you know. And I think also the humor lets you stand back from it a bit and sort of see it what it is, you know what I mean? Like I even have there's a little bit of like some Hotep dudes in there because I wanted to talk about Big in Philly. It's the same thing. Like they could seem jokey, but also I was like, you know, like that it helps give some perspective, I think, hopefully.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point of using humor as a way to kind of like ground the events that happen in your book that kind of like get absurd, but also are very real, and the humor kind of like really kind of helps you absorb it as not real, but like it makes it more emotionally potent, I guess. Which is really interesting because that's like I struggle with injecting humor into my work because I think I'm funny, but my work I like to be like dramatic and like like people are like crying and mad all the time because that's what's fun for me, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, that's a really good point. Um, I guess for my like young adult people, um, everyone, Mike, your book is also, it's not like autobio, right? This character is not you, but like inspired by you, correct?
Right.
Okay, so like I think that's kind of true for all of our books. They're very close to us. How like why did you choose to do fiction over like auto fiction? What did that distance do for you in your book?
Honestly, I felt more liberated by going a fictional route. Um, I just wanted it to. There were things I wanted to say with the story that maybe would have been tricky if I had remained true to the timeline of my life. And um, I don't spend a lot of time revealing to people like this really happened, this didn't really happen to me. Um, but I've definitely experienced a lot of the things that happened in the book. Sometimes there were things that happened in like later years or earlier years. I don't know. I guess the overall I guess message of the story was more important than my personal story, I guess, is my point. Whereas like this isn't about me. I'm not making this I mean, every book I make, sure, I make for myself, but the point of this isn't to be like, oh, look at my life and my trials and tribulations. It's more like, hey, I've been there. I understand what some of you are going through. Because something I didn't mention in the beginning when you asked me about the seed was like, yeah, it's based on my life, but it's more that like I felt there was a need for a book like this because I didn't have this book when I was 14, and this is the book that I did need. So this is more what I'm thinking of, like making the book for my younger self, because I know that there are people out there who would relate to that kid. Um, I mean, I was like a chubby, half Asian queer kid, like who am I seeing in books and media in 1995 that I feel a connection with, So yeah, that's my point, is that the reader became more important than myself when I was creating the book. So that's why I went that route. And also I should add, there are some fantasy elements to the book that I was all ready to go all in on. So obviously if it was like autobiographical, I mean, I guess I could have taken some liberties, but I just felt I could really have some fun with that stuff. Yeah.
Trung, what about you?
I took a slightly different tack with it in that I wound up being a little bit more organized in that than I thought I was going to be as well, which surprised me because I am not a terribly organized person, but the ways that I wound up doing this book were very regimented down to the ways that people express their feelings. But one thing that I was really conscientious of in terms of like which parts were drawn from my life and which weren't is that all of the more fictionalized elements of the book are all kind of the organic interactions between the characters. And so they're kind of based on my experiences, but like when something is made from a space where like I can, you know, assume goodwill, and the gesture of the characters' lives and their emotions and the ways that they're feeling towards each other, like I am totally comfortable fictionalizing those things. The things that I hewed pretty closely to my real life experiences were any interactions with institutions that I had growing up. One of the more kind of important things that popped up while I was going through this book was that oftentimes immigrant children tend to have to navigate institutions that most parents have to, and because their parents don't have like the linguistic capacity to go through them. And so they end up being taken advantage of, or people in figures of like people who are in positions of authority over them have control over their lives in some way, are giving them bad information or information that is not easily communicable to their parents. And so anytime like there is an administrator or like a teacher within the book, or like even kind of the more benevolent moments, like at libraries, like anytime there is an institution present, like those are all experiences that I had. But if there is like a warm moment between the characters, like those tend to be fictionalized, because I think those things can be dynamic, and kind of going through a fictionalized lens kind of grants me a little bit more freedom, just because I think memory is imperfect, and I will be more inclined to hold the kind of institutional experiences to account, and all of the like organic interactions between people can happen as they happen, however I remember them and however fondly I feel about them.
Awesome. Yeah, that's very well put. I don't really have any comment on that. I'm just like, yeah. Kiku, what about you? You're not just doing contemporary fiction, you also have this speculative element. So I'm interested in why you made those choices.
Yeah, sort of what I was talking about earlier about sort of already coming into this knowing that there were things that I was never going to know was sort of one of the reasons why fiction felt more authentic in a lot of ways than trying to pass off things that I was only cobbling together from memory and research as like the facts of what happened. So the time travel element or memory travel element was really a way of getting around that. And in relation to that, my character throughout the book is trying to meet my grandmother's character, but never actually gets to come face to face and talk with her. And that was, again, because I wasn't confident in my ability to create an authentic voice for my grandmother, and I felt it would be disrespectful to even try. So it became sort of this metaphor for trying to find parts of your past that you're never going to be able to confront or access. And in a similar way, all the characters that my character meets in camp are fictional as well. They are, sort of combinations of different opinions and viewpoints that I encountered when I was researching camp. And I really wanted to, create characters that could represent all these different viewpoints, because I felt like growing up hearing about camp, there was always sort of one narrative and one reaction to incarceration that I heard about from Japanese Americans, because it was, sort of the most placating one. It was the one that sort of viewed Japanese Americans as being very, I guess, American or loyal, and not questioning what was happening and not being outspoken against what was happening. And of course, in researching, I found out that was completely not true. There were lots of people questioning what was happening, and there were lots of everyday moments of resistance to the incarceration. So I really wanted to create these characters that represented those different viewpoints that I didn't hear a lot growing up. But again, it felt disingenuous to include real people who I'd never met in the book. So yeah, I tried to avoid that as much as possible.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like a lot of the characters are like a inspirational mix of like family and friends for me. But they're not very, besides like personality and like some elements of like their life history, I try to kind of pull them away from either what they look like or more concrete details of their life. Because I guess I really thrive on like my work not being predictable. So like I don't like to outline So that was the biggest thing, basically fictionalizing the story, even though it's inspired by a lot of like real life experiences. I like to be surprised by my characters and my story. That's what keeps me drawing it. And I also like, I don't know, I'm like all for like navel gazing. Like I'm all for the specific, like I want people to be like so interior and like esoteric that like I am like sometimes lost, or sometimes it makes you like opens up a whole new perspective, which I feel like all of you have done, and that's really cool to me and very valuable. I guess for my last question, I'm interested in like, you know, you've done your book, you've had people read it. Have you struggled with maybe criticisms or misreadings, or even with the book itself, like looking back on it, like what are things you're like unsatisfied with? I'm interested in your perspective on the book now. Mike, do you want to start?
Sure. Let's see. I mean, I guess the last bit of the question, you know, if there's anything that would change, I feel like anything I've ever made, there's always something. There's just always something that you want to change. And, you know, there were a few things I missed on the proofs, and it went to press, and it was like, so, you know, I changed it for the second printing, but forgot one. And so it's like, oh, and now there's another one, same for the third printing. Anyway, it's fine. But to your bigger question of, or I guess I should also say though, like, I wouldn't change anything overall though. I guess it's just details, the devil in the details. But about criticism, it's an interesting thing to think about. I had a lot of anxiety before the book came out because I was wondering how the queer community would respond to the book. I feel like I can say this because I'm family, but I feel like my people can be very opinionated, and so I was very relieved when it's been like overwhelmingly positive feedback. I guess the criticisms, or not even criticisms, the difficulties some people have, I think, I don't have people's backgrounds, right? I don't know who they are, where they live, what they're about, but you know, sometimes I'll see or hear something about like, oh, that was, you know, it was really hard to read. And it's just like, well, you know, there were things that made me uncomfortable. I'm like, yes, that
It was
by
hard for
design.
me too.
Yeah.
It was hard to live.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. It's like, okay, yes, you need to feel uncomfortable because that's flagging something for you, right? Like, oh, something's going on here. Obviously, something's afoot. So if you've experienced those uncomfortable moments, you're, you know, and I've heard this too, where people are like, oh, this is like bringing up old stuff for me, and it's painful. And I hear that, and like I really am so grateful for the people that get triggered by the story, that hang in there till the end. But it just reinforces that like these are real issues. And for the people who don't have that experience, it's like, well, just what you were saying, Sloan, it's just like, well, you're going to read this book and you're going to continue to be okay, right? You're not actually living this experience. You're just, you're just taking a peek at what it might be like for someone who does live that. So I'm fine with making people uncomfortable. I just hope that they just read it and sit with the uncomfort, because that's how we learn.
Yeah, I feel that a lot. My story has like, you know, family abuse, drug use, a student teacher relationship, you know, this underage student. And a lot of people didn't like that. Surprisingly, the biggest critique I got was that I showed these teenagers smoking. That really upset people. And they're like, you didn't like put a disclaimer that smoking is bad. And I'm like, I'm not, this is not a PSA. This is just a story.
Yeah.
It was very, very strange at that, like the teacher-student relationship. I haven't gotten any comments on that, but the smoking, that really set people off. And I was like,
It's so funny, the things, I mean, like people will complain about language, right? Like, oh, the language, use the F word a lot. And it's like, teenagers use the F word. Teenagers use this language. I'm not gonna like make a sugar-coated experience for you. So it's just, one thing, and then I will step back. But I just feel like books for youth, there are already so many gatekeepers standing in between youth and like books that they want that reflect them. And I think in this country, in this society, we like want to shield our youth from whatever. But it's not just shielding them from bad things. It's more like controlling them. It's like, these are people who are growing up to be adults. You need to give them their freedoms and let them talk how they want to talk and like read what they want to read. And you can have conversations together about what they're reading, right? And not just say, you can't read that because there's this content in it. It's like, I just feel like, I don't know, I'm about to go down a rabbit hole. So I'm just going to leave that there.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I feel like young adult and middle grade books are very like sanitized, but like teens and like young adults are like the messiest, nastiest like people. Like my characters are so nasty to each other. They get into like physical altercations, and like that was how I was and the environment I grew up in. So when I don't see that, I'm like, I don't relate. Y'all are happy. I don't relate.
Yeah,
You're
teenagers
like
are
lying and
messy.
backstabbing. I don't get it. Trung, do you want to tell us a little bit if you have like, if you got like criticism from like external sources or like internal sources, or you're like, oh, I should have done something else?
Not really. Like, I'm of the mind that like stories will like change, and your relationship with the story will change over time. And so everybody's relationship with my book is going to be different from my relationship with it as like the author. And I'm sure when I read it later on, I will have like, I'll be in a different place. And so my relationship with the story will be different then too. So I don't really have anything in it where I'm like, oh, I wish this were different, or I wish I'd done this differently. Like, I always think about the worst piece of comic book advice that I've ever gotten was somebody was like, yeah, when you make a comic book, you have to like make sure all the clothes are like really plain so that it can be timeless, so that people don't know where in time this takes place. And I'm like, no, you have to be really real about where you are. It's like, time is a part of, the texture of the storytelling. It's an essential part of like making sure that the the space where you tell the story from is honest. So I don't really have anything like that I would change about the way that I do it. And I'm kind of unconcerned about other people's relationship with my work as well. I think oftentimes, and like I don't think that I've gotten any criticisms from like concerned parents about the contents of the book. I've like gotten a lot of like, people are kind of confused about whether I wrote it for a young adult audience or for a middle grade audience, because the protagonist is 13 and the deuteragonist is in her 30s. And so it's very like, okay, like I kind of consider that my audience like ostensibly is young adults. And so these are people who are smart, who are very young, who have the capacity to empathize with people outside of their age range, and who are really good at picking up on thematic things that matter to them. And so and like, they're really aware when you're condescending to them. So you just need to write something that you think they'll enjoy. So yeah, not really concerned about a lot of things in terms of like my feedback. And even if I do get kind of like concerned parent feedback, it's usually um, not really coming from a place of concern for the children. It's oftentimes kind of about working out their own issues and being uncomfortable with the things that are in front of them. And teenagers and young people are very good at kind of self-selecting, like, oh, I'm not ready for this, I'm going to seek out something else. Like, I've never had any issues with kids because if it's not for them, they largely ignore it. So as far as my audience goes, I don't have any persisting concerns.
Yeah, I love that. Also, that's a good point. That's true also of my like critics are all like adults, and also like sometimes they don't have kids.
Mhm.
So they're just kind of, I'm like, why are you what is your issue here?
Yes, whose children are you concerned about actually?
Yeah.
And like in my book, there's like lots of like there are a lot of like kind of like there's some light cannibalism in it, like there are in a lot of fairy tales, and like nobody's concerned about like violence to the extent that they kind of claim to be. Like they're always kind of looking for things that, you know, are not really about what it's about sometimes.
Yeah, totally. Kiku, do you want to go next?
Sure, yeah. I have sort of a complicated, I keep going back and forth on how I feel because I have gotten the question of, do you think including so much of like Donald Trump and of the 2016 election will date the story? And I on the one hand, I feel like, again, like Trung was saying, it's like an authentic reflection of when it was written and the events that were happening that led to a lot of, you know, people speaking about camp again, a lot of Japanese Americans coming out and talking about camp again. So it is in that way cementing that part as, you know, a part of Japanese American history. It really, you know, several organizations founded because of, you know, reactions to policies that were being promoted by Donald Trump. So I do think in that way, you know, it authentically is a part of that history. On the other hand, especially now, I worry that a lot of sort of these, I guess, neoliberal types will look at it and as an endorsement that only Donald Trump is responsible for these issues, which of course is not true. You know, there are still camps that are, you know, being used to, you know, keep kids in cages at the border. There's still, you know, this history has gone way before Trump and it will go way after. And so in that way, I wish that I had emphasized other parts as much, if that makes sense. So yeah, this is complicated. I don't know. I do want to, yeah, just take this opportunity to say it didn't end with Trump and it didn't start with him. So
Yeah, that's a really good point. And also like, it's a good point, but it's also not something I feel like you necessarily need to worry about. Like you're telling a very specific and intimate story that's, you know, focused on you, like a fictional, you know, kind of view. And I feel like for people that are still ignorant of like all of history, like that's a them problem. And like historical context for what's happening now, they're like, oh my gosh, this has been a terrible 4 years. And I'm like, this has been happening. Like, I'm just like looking at people like indigenously, like it's been, you know?
yeah, I
But,
do wish also that in related, I wish that I had called out FDR more explicitly. I should have put his name in there more because he's still such like a neoliberal dreamboat, but I'm like, FDR.
Oh man. Ben, do you wanna, you'll be our last answer, but yeah, what are some criticisms or things you worried about or would change with your book? Or maybe you don't want to change it.
I don't think about changing the books just because like it's done. You know what I mean? Like I think usually when I look back at a book sometime after it's out, I feel like what I'd want to change would fundamentally change the book itself. So it's like I may as well just make a sequel, a different book or whatever. I think that I get like the same amount of like whatever like weird like range of like criticisms. I think something that struck me after the book came out when reading reviews of it, because it was you know reviewed kind of widely, and that is mostly off the strength of me doing like a real you know woke sad Black people book, you know, like a couple years ago that like people you know that people liked. And in some ways I think I'll get negative reviews because like there's a lot of people who you know I like other marginalized people, there's a lot of you know white people that would like us to just be this sort of conduit for instructions about how they should be living their life, you know. So I'll get negative reviews just because I'm not providing that, and it very specifically like I don't really want to do that kind of work anymore. But anyway, with this book specifically, and I sort of anticipated because like I made it for a very very small audience, you know, it's a book of, kind of about football that is not about football. It's a book about anarchism, but it's not an introductory book about anarchism. Like if you don't know anything about anarchism, I don't even know that you get that about that book. You know, I made it basically for my friends that's not the most of who is in the world, right? So I was really curious about what the reviews would be like. And it was, it's like reviewed. And in general, it seemed like a lot of people took away from it that it was like sort of like a radically moderate book. It was sort of like, because I do like to, like, I'm not really discerning about like my depictions of people. It's like one of the most obnoxious characters is a Black anarchist. You know what I mean? Like if there's an antagonist other than like the smattering of like fascists or whatever, it's this one dude that doesn't shut up. You know what I mean? So I guess you could take away that I'm like also giving it to anarchists, So that was something that like was kind of concerning. So because there would be a positive, most of like the written reviews, like in the New York Times or whatever, was like, oh, this is a really good book. And then would talk about what it's about. I'm like, but that's not what the book is about. So that made me feel like pretty concerned and sort of made me rethink like the ways in which I'm approaching these certain topics. It's like, certainly like a book is not really done until like someone reads it, right? Until interpretation. But it's like also has made me feel like the ways that I express I want people to have certain takeaways, you know what I mean? And certainly not that like I'm out here being like, I don't know, everyone's crazy, believe in nothing, because that's an establishment point of view, basically. So yeah. And I mean, other than that, there was some people that are like, there's not enough about football. I thought this was going to be about football. And then there was like one or two people that are like, this is too violent. And I'm like, I don't know, like there's guns on the cover. Like, I don't know what to tell you. The guns were going to go off. That's the rule with guns. So yeah, in general, like I honestly don't really sweat like most critiques that I get, you know what I mean? But when there's just but the positive review for a book that seems like they're describing a totally different book, and that happened quite a bit, that was really concerning.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And like, yeah, I don't know what to do with that when people wildly misinterpret things, but I don't know. I don't internalize a lot of reviews. Like I like when someone likes it, I'm like, oh yay. But yeah, I don't know. I kind of disconnect from my work after it's done because it's kind of like a thing that only matters during the process of making it for me, and then it becomes like a little like relic of the past. And I feel like which can be kind of scary, especially when making books, because it's it's kind of like a snapshot of who you were and your process and aesthetic perspective. And maybe people will find it problematic in the future, but I think it's like valuable to have that. Also, like writing something that like my book is set in like 2006, and like someone was like, "Oh, this is a cool like historical graphic novel," and I was like, "Oh." No. Like I guess you're right. But yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I don't really have any other questions. Maybe you guys can tell us where our viewers can buy your books, where they can follow you. Mike, do you wanna plug yourself?
Sure. I mean, you can get my book anywhere. I've been promoting bookshop.org to help support independent bookshops. And you can find me on Twitter at Mike Corrado, Instagram at Mike_Corrado. I've been I have to be honest, I've been taking some like social media mental health breaks pretty frequently these days. So I'm on, I'm off, I'm on, I'm off. And I know this is pre-recorded, but yeah, there's been a lot of news, a lot of really hard news lately. So I'll be around when I'm around, and I will sign off with saying that Black Lives Matter, trans lives matter, stop Asian hate. So thank you.
Trung, you want to go next?
So I am available everywhere on the internet as @Trungles. So that's Twitter and Instagram and Tumblr as well. Although I don't use that very often. My website is trungles.com. It's pretty consistent, so I'm pretty easy to find. My debut graphic novel, The Magic Fish, is available wherever books are sold. So try to support your independent bookstores, send in a request, or check them out at the library. I love it when people check out my books at the library as well. I'm not super concerned about sales. I guess locally speaking, like I live in South Minneapolis, and the Derek Chauvin case is going on right now. And an organization locally that's been doing a lot of really great work, kind of organizing and galvanizing local community activists, is Reclaim the Block. And you can find more information about them at reclaimtheblock.org.
Ben?
Oh, likewise, you can get Sports as Hell at the library. Like I know a couple branches got it, even though it's floppy. And otherwise, maybe get it from Silver Sprocket Bicycle Club. They got an online shop or whatever. Don't buy it from Amazon, but if you do buy it from Amazon, say you didn't get it and keep that book and you get your money back. And then, other than that, ACAB, fuck a fascist, you know what I mean? I don't know. Let's hope, let's hope for hope. I don't know.
Kiku?
You can get Displacement wherever books are sold. Again, don't buy from Amazon. They support ICE. They ruin our communities, and they're trying to become the next company town. So anyway, get it from your local bookstore or from the library is great. Or you can get it from my local bookstore, Third Place Books, which I love, and I would love if you supported them. On Twitter, I'm at Kiku Hughes. I'm also not particularly active, but that's where you can find me. And yeah.
Awesome. And I'm Sloan Sloan on Twitter. SloanSloan.com is my website. A cool website that was going around yesterday was ihollaback.org, and they have free workshops where it's like bystander intervention training, and I thought that was like a really interesting thing that I haven't heard of before. So you can go there and sign up for free. So thank you, everyone. It was so nice to talk to you. I love talking to my cartoonist people. Kate, Claire, thank you for having us.
Thank you, Sloan.
Thank
And
you.
Thanks to the Get Lit Festival too.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. That was so wonderful. Thank you, Trung, Ben, Kiku, Mike, and Sloan. I feel like I could listen to you all talk for another hour. That was really, really great. So thank you all. And a special thanks to Sloan for doing such an expert job at moderating that conversation. That was just really, really wonderful. And it was great to just learn more about all of your processes and your inspirations. And it was really inspiring to me as well. So thank you. And for our audience at home, don't forget that you can learn more about all of these writers and artists, check out other festival events, and donate to help support our festival by visiting our website, getlitfestival.org. And thank you all again for joining us. Good night, everybody.